Hello friends, thank you for watching this video. I am Mohamad and today we'll be learning about GraphQL with ASP.NET Core 5. We'll be building a to-do list application with GraphQL. So, what are we going to be covering today? First, we're going to be discussing the problem that GraphQL will going to help us solve. Then we're going to be discussing what is GraphQL. And then we're going to be discussing the difference between GraphQL and Rust. Then we're going to go into the concepts of GraphQL. Then we're going to discuss the ingredients that we're going to be needing in order to build our application. And lastly, we're going to be coding our to-do list application. As always, you will find the source code in the description down below. Please like, share and subscribe if you like this video. It will really help the channel. In order to understand GraphQL, let us understand the problem that it solves. It was originally built by Facebook to solve their problem with data fetching. Back in 2012, when Facebook released their application, it had a lot of criticism about performance, the lag, the battery drainage. As well, it was doing a lot of API calls in order for it to fetch the data, which was causing all of these issues. So as we can see here, basically whenever anyone would have opened the Facebook application on their mobile phone, all of these requests were going on in order for them to populate their timeline. So it was getting the ID of the user, then the messages and the number of messages. It was getting the events that the user is going to be attending, as well as there any number of notification, some of the newsfeed functionality and information. Then it's going to be popping in the news friends suggestions as well as friends' birthdays. So all of these were happening. So as we can see here, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost 7 calls going at the same time. And that's only the beginning. So that caused a lot of load on the mobile phone in order for it to do all of these requests simultaneously in order for it to populate the information. So what happened? Facebook released after that, or basically created after that, introduced something called GraphQL, which turned all of these requests into a single request. With that single API endpoint, so that Facebook has introduced with GraphQL, we could have retrieved any data that we want from the server by using the GraphQL query language. So we had one API request, or basically one API endpoint, and we were using the GraphQL query language in order for us to send our custom query to Facebook back then, in order for us to get the information that we wanted, where we tell the API exactly the information that we want and the API will return it. So basically we're delegating the process of data management to the API instead of us doing it from the client side. So instead of us doing all of these requests from the client side and then managing all of these requests, we will send one request to the API with the GraphQL query language, and within that query that we have sent, we specify all of the information that we want, and then the API will basically process that request and then generate the data that we want back to us. So instead of having around 8 requests or 7 requests, we converted into a single request. So let's analyze the query that we have. We currently here now have nesting objects inside the same request that we are requesting for more information. So as you can see here, we have data, then we have user, then we have friends. So we can see here we have the nested object functionality implemented in order for us to get more data. Here we have, for example, one for friends, one for get the user information, but here all of them is integrated into a single request with nested object. As well, we are taking what was different request, and instead of making the client be responsible for figuring out the logic of handling all of these requests and the data that needs in order to process and get the information from the API, we are delegating all of this request to the server and requesting the server to handle the information binding based on the GraphQL query language that we have sent. So basically that facilitated the implementation on the client side of any data handling request. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with existing data. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API. It gives also the client the power to ask anything they want, or basically any format of the data they want, and the API will return it back to them. It has the ability of getting multiple resources in a single request. So basically GraphQL queries access not just only the properties that we want, but also smoothly follow the references between them. While typical REST APIs require loading from multiple URLs, GraphQL's APIs gets all of the data in a single request. Now let's discuss the difference between REST and GraphQL. So the main differences, there are a lot of differences and a lot of similarities when it comes to Rust and GraphQL. But let's first discuss the main differences. So when it comes to REST APIs, we have multiple endpoints to achieve our goals. While in GraphQL, we have only one endpoint that we request, but we send a GraphQL query language with that request in order for us to get the information. Within Rust, we need to do some chain requests in order for us to get a series of information. Like for example, first we need to get the user ID, and then based on the user ID we request the user, and then based on that user information we get the user's events, and based on that we get the location of those events, and so on and so forth. But in GraphQL we have one request with different mappings and nested object in order for us to get the information that we need. Rust has something called overfetching. What does that mean? So basically when we request, for example, a user information from a user API, we get all different kind of information back. Like we get the name, the email, the date of birth, for example, the first name, the last name, separate fields, and all these types of information. Although we only want, for example, the ID and the email address, but we get all of those information, and that's called overfetching. While in GraphQL, we don't have that, because within our query language, we only specify what we need. So we only specify the ID and then the email that we need. As well, within Rust, we have something called underfetching, which basically we get less information that we need. So for example, let's say we get from Facebook the list of events that we want. We need to do another call to get the list of the venues where those events is, and then we need to do another call to get the list of attendees for those events. While in GraphQL, we can actually specify exactly what we want within a single call, so there's no underfetching anymore. As well, REST API is way easier to develop because it's way more easier to implement those functionality. GraphQL is much more complicated to develop, and the information, basically the structure that we need to implement, is way more complicated than Rust. But the difference comes when the clients are using it. So whenever there's a client who's trying to consume our API, the REST API is much more complicated to consume because we have some change requests, we have some logic that we need to implement, we need to handle overfetching and underfetching. When it comes to GraphQL, the client basically specifies the exact query that they want, and there is only one single API link endpoint that they need to communicate with. So when should we use which? There are multiple cases when we should use REST API, and there's multiple cases when we should use GraphQL. So for example, if we're using non-interactive calls, so between systems, we can use Rust. If there's any microservices call, Rust is a very good option to do that. As well, if we have, for example, simple repeated queries, we can use Rust. While GraphQL will be really helpful if we have real-time application or real-time messages. If we're using mobile application in order for us to communicate, GraphQL will be a really good scenario to implement there. As well, if we have a really advanced query that it's going to require a lot of Rust calls, we can implement instead in GraphQL. So just to be clear, I'm not really here bashing REST API. REST API is a really strong implementation of APIs, and Rust is really widely used, while GraphQL is still in infancy and there's a lot of work to be done on it. The purpose of this is just to illustrate the different reasoning that why you might need to use Rust over GraphQL and vice versa. I'm still a strong believer in Rust, and there's a lot of growth that coming in Rust. And these are not the only two technologies that exist in order for us to communicate with an API. There is also something called gRPC, which is also a very strong technology. And there's another video that I dive into gRPC, which I'm gonna link in the description as well. You can find it here on the upper right hand side. But also this slide here, just so you can understand that Rust and the GraphQL both have their right place to utilize, and both can be used interchangeably. But these are basically the main scenarios where you might think you want to use Rust over Graph or Graph over Rust. So now let's discuss the core concepts of GraphQL. So basically GraphQL we're going to be discussing here 6 main concepts, but there's a lot more concepts that we can discuss as well. So first of all is going to be the schema. The schema in GraphQL is basically the full API. It's going to be the queries, the objects. So basically it's going to be summarizing the full API for us. Once we're going to be building our application, we're going to see the schema in action. The query is basically going to be the main entry point for us within GraphQL. So basically that's going to be the endpoint that we're going to be sending all of our requests to. Types can be anything what we want. It could be a query, it could be a mutation, it could be a subscription, but basically it could be the model that we want to utilize within our GraphQL. Mutation will allow us to update and edit, delete our data. Resolvers is going to be responsible to handling and returning the data back to us. And subscription is going to be responsible for any WebSocket. Basically, a subscription is going to be the WebSocket connection, which allow us to send real-time messages when we do any changes or we're going to do any action within our GraphQL. Again, this is a very high overview of these core concepts. We're going to be discussing them in details once we start implementing our application. So, what are the ingredients that we want? First, we're going to need Visual Studio Code, and then we're going to require .NET 5 SDK. The reason that we are going to be using .NET 5 SDK because we're going to be utilizing some of the feature that .NET 5 provide, which is going to be records. So it's really good for you to have the .NET 5 SDK installed. And then we're going to be utilizing Insomnia. You can also actually use as well Postman if you want, but I rather use Insomnia because it has much more better support for GraphQL. And lastly, we're going to be utilizing DB Beaver so we can actually open our local database and view the data inside of it. Now let's get coding. So now let's start by implementing our application, or actually creating our application. The first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be checking the .NET SDK version. So in order for us to do that, we're going to be utilizing the .NET -- version. So inside our terminal, we need to type .NET -- version. And as we can see here, I have the latest version installed of .NET SDK, which is 5.0.202. And I really encourage you to have the .NET 5 SDK version installed because we're going to be utilizing some of the .NET 5 features. If you have any other issue like an error showing up, you need to re-download the application, and then you need to re-download the SDK and reinstall it. It's a very straightforward process. Next, since we're going to be utilizing Entity Framework, we need to have the Entity Framework tool installed on our machine. So how are we going to do that? Basically, we're going to be utilizing the .NET tool keyword. So .NET tool install -- global .NET -ef. And as you can see here, I have already installed it, so I got the method that has been already installed. But for you, if you haven't installed it before, this will take a few seconds to install. Great. The next step is we're going to be creating our application. So in order to do that, we're going to be utilizing the .NET new web keyword, and then we're going to give it a name, and we're going to call it Todo List QL. It should also take a few seconds, sorry. And now that has been created, let's navigate to that folder, and then let's open it in our code editor. Perfect. Now that we have our application open, let's open our terminal. We go to View, and we select Terminal. And the first thing we're going to be doing, just to make sure that everything is running as it should be, we're just going to be .NET build, and we should see the application build successfully. This should take a few seconds, and we can see here build succeeded. Great. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing some packages that we're going to be utilizing. So first of all, just before we delve into anything else, we're going to be utilizing the Hot Chocolate framework for .NET to implement GraphQL. This is becoming one of the most popular framework for implementing GraphQL with .NET. So just wanted to say that before we start. So the first package that we're going to be installing is going to be the Entity Framework package. So .NET add package Microsoft.entity framework core.design. Should take a few seconds. Okay, I think there's let's see if it's added successfully. Perfect. We can see here that the package has been added successfully. Great. So the second package that we're going to be adding is the SQLite, because we're going to be utilizing SQLite as our database. So it's going to be .NET add package Microsoft dot entity framework core dot SQLite. This should also take a few seconds. Great. Now we're going to be utilizing the hot chocolate framework for ASP.NET Core. So .NET add package hot chocolate .ASP.NET Core. This should also take a few seconds to be installed. Great. Still installing. Perfect. Now we're going to be utilizing entity framework for hot chocolate. So we're going to be put .NET add package hot chocolate .data .entity framework. Great. This should take also a few seconds. And lastly, we're going to utilize something called the Voyager within GraphQL. So .NET add package GraphQL .server .ui .voyager. This should take a few seconds. Perfect. Now let's verify that all of these packages has been installed. We have 5 packages. So here we can see that the Voyager has been installed, Hot Chocolate ASP.NET Core correctly, Entity Framework for Hot Chocolate, as well the Entity Framework design, as well the SQLite. Great. Now once we have all of these installed successfully, the next step for us is to build our application, make sure it's still building as it should. So .NET build. Great, has been built successfully. Now the next step for us is we're gonna be starting building our DB context and our models. So the first thing we're gonna be doing is let's first create our models, and from that and after that we create our DB context. So inside the root directory of our application, let us create a new folder and we'll call that folder models. Great. Inside that models folder, we're gonna be creating 2 classes. The first class is gonna called item data, and item data is gonna have around 6 properties. So first of all, it's gonna be the ID. So prop, it's gonna be of type int, and then the ID, and then prop, we're gonna put string, and this is gonna be the title. Great. And then we're gonna put description for our to-do list item. So property string, and this is gonna be the description. And then after that, we're gonna just make a small boolean if it's done or not. So property boolean, put is done. And then basically we're gonna add it to a list. So basically we're gonna have a to-do list item, and we're gonna have multiple lists. So we can have, for example, one list for work, one list for personal. So we're gonna add the list ID, so prop int, and we're gonna make it as a list ID. And lastly, we're gonna create this now. We're gonna link it to our item list. So we're gonna make it public virtual item list. We don't have this class yet. We're gonna create it after this, and we're gonna call it item list. And then we're gonna make the get and set. Great. Now let's create this item list. Inside our models folder, when you create a new class, we call it item list. Great. And this item list basically is going to have an ID and a name and a connection to the item data. So first of all, let us create the ID. So property int ID. And then now we're going to create a name of type string. And now we're just going to be connecting the list to the to-do list items. So public virtual collection of item data, and we're gonna call it item datas. And as well, we're gonna put the get and the set. Let us fix those references. Great. And now let's create the constructor. And basically we're gonna be initializing this list in the constructor. It's gonna be item datas equal new hash set of item data. Great. So now that we have created our models and we have linked them both together, so we have the first model, which is going to be the item data, and we have the second model, which is going to be the list that all of these data is going to belong to. So basically we're going to have, as we said, one for to-do list item for work and another to-do list item for personal, and then we're going to add items to both of these lists. Now we need to create our application DB context. So inside our root directory, we need to create a new folder called data. And inside this data folder, we're going to create a new class, and this class is going to be API DB context. Great. Once we have created this API DB context, the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be inheriting from the DB context class. And this class is provided for us by the entity framework package that we have added to our application, which is this one, Microsoft.entityframework core.design. Great. Now, once we have done that, now let's add our two models here so we can create tables based on that. So we're going to utilize public virtual dbsat, and then we're going to call it item data. This is going to be for the items. I'm going to call it items. Great. And we're going to put the get and the set. Let's fix those references. And now let's create the other one, which is going to be public virtual dbsat of type item list, and this is going to be the lists. Great. And get and a set. Perfect. Now once we have done that, now we need to initialize the API DB context, the constructor for it. So gonna be, let's see, ctor. Okay, great. This is a constructor, and basically it's gonna take the DB context options, and then we're gonna pass it the API DB context options, and then basically because we are inheriting from the DB context, we need to pass it to the basic class options. Perfect. I have another video which I delve into the creation of application DB context and basically the entire entity framework when it comes to the ASP.NET Core, which I'm going to be linked in the upper right hand side if you want more information about application DB context and why do we do it this way. So once we have done that, the last step is we need to link the two tables together, and for us we're going to be utilizing the onModel creating method, which basically allow us to do the dynamic linking instead of relying on entity framework to do that for us. So protected override void onModel creating model builder. Great. And basically in order for us to utilize this, the first thing we need to do is we need to put base.onModel creating. Basically we need to send back the model builder to the basic class, and once we have done that, now we can actually utilize the model builder in order for us to map the tables together instead of relying on entity framework. So model builder dot entity item data, and basically from that moment we gotta utilize a link function, and then within this link function we're gonna be utilizing the entity dot has one with a d and d dot item list, and we're gonna put with many. Basically we're creating a one-to-many relationship. P dot item datas, and then basically we're gonna specify the foreign key, so has foreign key, and this is gonna be the list ID, so the dot list ID, and lastly we're gonna specify the onDelete. You don't really need to do that, but it's better to add it. So the delete behavior we're gonna say restrict, and then lastly we're gonna specify the connection name, so has constraint name. We're gonna specify the constraint name, and we're gonna make it foreign key between item data and the item list. Okay, perfect. So now basically all of the work that we're currently doing is not related to GraphQL in any shape, way or form. We're just setting up our application in order for it to connect to a database in order before we can actually send some requests to it and pull data and pull some information back from the API. So this is all we're building the boilerplate before we can actually utilize GraphQL. So once we have done that, now we have created our model. The next step for us is we need to update our app settings so we can specify the connection string for our database. Since we're going to be using SQLite, we're going to be utilizing the connection string for SQLite. So let's open app settings, and the first thing we're going to be adding is connection strings, and basically we're going to add the default connection, and from here we're going to utilize the SQLite connection string, which is going to be data source equal app.db, and we're just going to specify the cache equal shared. Great. So once we have done that, the next step for us is to update the startup class so we can actually inject the connection string to our startup class and utilize the API DB context. So let's open our startup class, and the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a constructor for this startup class, and we're going to be specifying a new variable. So first let's start with a variable. It's going to be public iConfiguration. Gonna call it configuration, and it's gonna have a get because we're gonna be setting it through the constructor of the startup class. So let's fix its references, and now let's create the constructor, and basically within this constructor we're gonna specify the iConfiguration and configuration, and from that moment forward we're gonna say configuration equal configuration. So how is this being initiated? So here the constructor is utilizing a dependency injection via the constructor in order for it to initialize. There's a lot of resources out there if you want to learn more about dependency injection. If you're really interested in it, please write in the comments down below, and I will create a video covering dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. So once we have created the configuration, now what we need to do is we need to update our configure service methods in order for us to utilize the API DB context. So inside our configure services method, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go services. We're going to be adding the DB context, and then we're going to be specifying the API DB context. Specify the options, and basically the options will allow us to use SQLite, and then basically right now we need to specify the connection string for that SQLite. And how are we going to specify that connection string? We're going to be utilizing the connection string that we have added inside our appsetting.json. So we're going to utilize the configuration dot get connection string, and then basically we want to get the default connection. So let us first fix those references, and we'll examine what we have done here. So fix this one and fix this one. So basically the first thing that we done is we have added the configuration, and this will allow us to access the information inside this app settings files. And once we have added the configuration, the next step, this one is wrong. So the next step is for us to update the configure services method in order for us to create a DB context and then add a connection string to that DB context. So the reason why we added a DB context inside the configure services is for this DB context to be available for us in the application lifecycle within the dependency injection. So in case we want to initiate this DB context from any controller or any class that we want, it will be available for us through dependency injection, and we don't really need to do anything else. So this is why it's a really good idea for us to add the services that add DB context to our startup class, so we have access to it. So once we have added the DB context here and specified which DB context we want to use, the next step that we did is we want to configure this DB context. And the way we configure it is by specifying options. And one of the main things that we have is we need to specify which provider that we want to use, because Entity Framework is it's mature. Entity Framework core is becoming really mature, so it can connect to a lot of different databases. It can connect to Microsoft SQL Server, it can connect to Postgres, it can connect to MySQL, but in our case we're utilizing SQLite. So this is why we're utilizing the use SQLite. But for example, if we're using SQL Server, we can say use. We need to install the package, but it will be something use.ms. So use SQL Server, for example. If it was Postgres, it will be use Postgres. And that way we configure it. But in our case, we're using SQLite, so we'll put .SQLite. And lastly, we're utilizing the configuration which we have initiated here in order for us to access the connection string, which is this one, in order to get the default connection, which is this string basically here. And after we have done that, we have just closed it. So this basically right now configure our application DB context, and it will automatically configure for us the models, and it injects the application DB context into our ASP.NET Core application. But right now, this doesn't mean that we have our database created, and that doesn't mean that we have the tables ready. So how do we do that? In order for us to accomplish that, we need to tell Entity Framework that it needs to create the migration scripts to create a database, and then we need to tell it to actually create it. And Entity Framework provides us with a really nice tool which is called the EF migration and EF databases. So inside our terminal, what we need to do is we need to type .NET EF migrations add, and we're gonna call it, because this is gonna be the initial migration, we're gonna call it initial migration, and then we're gonna click on enter. Just to take a few seconds, and basically on the root of our application, we're gonna see a new folder created called migrations, and we open this migrations. We can see that we have some code to create tables, and it has named table list, and we have another table items, and we can see that it's automatically populated all of the information for us. As well, it has created some constraints between this table and this table. Great. So now that we have our migration ready, but we don't have our database yet, because we need to tell Entity Framework that it needs to create that database for us and to actually execute this migration script. So how do we tell it to do that? Again, inside our terminal, we're going to be utilizing the .NET EF database update, and basically this command was going to scan the migration folder, see if there is any migration that it needs to execute, and then it will execute it. So once we click on enter, this should take a few seconds, and after that our database should appear on the left hand side. Great. So now we can see that we have something called AppDB that has been created for us, and this basically AppDB right now, if we open it, we are able to see the tables inside of it. So let's utilize dbbeaver to do that. So inside dbbeaver, we click on new connection, which shows SQLite. Next. And now let's browse where that file exists, and this should exist in desktop, YouTube. We have here app.db, and if we open this and click on test connection, we can see that it has connected successfully. And if we click on finish, we can see that the database has appeared here. And if we open the tables, we can see that we have two tables, the items and the lists. So if we open the items, we can see the columns, which is the ID, title, which is the one that we have done. If we click on the list, we can see it has ID name. Great. So now that we are 100% sure that our database has created successfully, and we have the migration running as it should be, now it's time for us to jump into GraphQL. So in order for us to start integrating GraphQL, what we need to do is inside the root directory of our application, we're going to create a new folder, and this folder is going to be called GraphQL. Great. So the first thing we're going to be creating inside this GraphQL is a query, and the query is going to be the main entry point for any request that's going to be coming into our GraphQL. So inside this folder here, let us create a new class, and this class we're gonna be calling it query. Great. And basically what we're gonna be utilizing here, we're gonna be creating a method inside this GraphQL, inside this query class, which is gonna basically connect to our application DB contacts, get the items, get the lists, and then return it back. So let's do that. So first of all, we're gonna, and one thing I would like to emphasize on that, because it's a GraphQL and it's a query, the return type for this needs to be of type iQueryable. So public iQueryable, great, of item list, and get list. And then basically right now we're going to be utilizing some hot chocolate references, because we are utilizing the hot chocolate package, and we're going to be utilizing something called service. Basically it will allow us to connect directly with our DB context and get the information. So we're going to put the API DB context, and then we're going to call it context, as simple as that. And basically what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be returning from the context the item list that we have. Now let's fix those references. So the first thing is the iQueryable, and then we're gonna fix the item list, and then let's fix the service, which is gonna be the hot chocolate, and then the API DB context. And if we hover on the API service here, we can see that this is belong to the hot chocolate ones, and here I think it needs to be lists. Yes, correct. So right now what we have here is we have a query, which is, once we do all of the wiring for hot chocolate, for a GraphQL, it's gonna connect to this one, and we're gonna be able to get the lists that exist in our database. So before we do anything else, let us go back to DB Beaver, and let us add a couple of lists. So view table, and let us add a new list. We'll call this, for example, work. And let's add another one. We'll call this one personal, for example. And let's say we're gonna create a new one. We'll call it, for example, food shopping. And once we have created these, let's save them. And now we have a list of 3. So when we want to test it, it's good to have some data already available in our database, although we're gonna create some mutations so we can automatically add data to our database through GraphQL. So once we have done that, now we need to update our startup class. So basically what we need to do right now is we need to update the startup class so we can inject the GraphQL into the middleware of ASP.NET Core. So let's go to the startup class, and inside the configure services method, what we're gonna be doing here is we're gonna put services.add GraphQL server, and basically we're gonna be linking this GraphQL server to the query that we have just created. So add a query type of type query, which was just added, and we're gonna close it. So let's fix this reference. Yes, utilizing, great. So what happened here? So as we said, the main entry point for our GraphQL, it's gonna be through a query. And basically the query that we're gonna have is the one that we have just created. And in order for us to utilize that, we need to add it to our startup class. And basically the way we add GraphQL to our startup class is we initialize a server or a GraphQL server from within our application. So a GraphQL server can live inside our ASP.NET application, and it will be responsible for executing all of the queries that's being coming in. So although it's gonna be basically an instance of a GraphQL server running inside our ASP.NET application, and it's gonna be handling everything that's coming in. So once we have done that, now we need a way for us to be able to communicate with the GraphQL. So how are we going to be able to communicate with the GraphQL? We need to add a mapping for it, and we need to add an endpoint for it. So right now, if we run the application, it's going to take us to this page and it's going to tell us hello world. We don't want that. What we want is we want a way where we can actually connect directly to GraphQL instead of having this. So let's delete this. And the first thing we're going to be adding is we're going to be adding an endpoint. And then we're going to say map GraphQL. And that's it. So right now, basically what we have done, this map GraphQL is going to be basically creating a GraphQL endpoint for us. And that GraphQL endpoint that we currently have is what we're going to be using in order for us to query the API. So after we have done that, we're going to configure something called the Voyager for GraphQL, but we're not going to use it right now. Maybe until the end of the video, we're going to display the usefulness of Voyager. But let us configure it from now. So we're going to put app.use GraphQL Voyager, and then basically it's going to be new Voyager. Not sure how to spell that, but option, and this is basically is gonna be let's say I think it's gonna take the GraphQL endpoint. Let's fix the references. It will make it easy for us to know what exactly the requirement. Okay. Yeah, it's gonna take, I think, the GraphQL endpoint, and as we said, the endpoint is gonna be GraphQL. And then after that, we're gonna be specifying the path for the Voyager, and we're gonna just make it the GraphQL-UI. Okay, great. So now that we have configured the Voyager within our GraphQL, the next step for us is let us build our application and run it and see what we are able to get with it. So the first thing, we're gonna build it, so .NET build. And this should take a few seconds. Great. Now we're gonna put .NET run. Perfect. Now we have our application running on port 5000 and 5001. Now let's open Insomnia. So within Insomnia, we're gonna be creating a new collection, and then we're gonna call this one GraphQL demo. Let's make it GraphQL demo, create. And inside this collection, basically right now, we're going to be adding all of the requests that GraphQL is going to utilize. So inside here, we can click on the small plus button, and we're going to create a request. And we're going to create this one, get lists, for example. And basically something you need to know that all of the GraphQL requests are post. There is no get. So every query that we need to do for GraphQL needs to be a post request. So for that, we need to change the get to a post. And then within the body, we need to specify that it's a GraphQL query. So Insomnia will know what type of information that it needs to send. Great. So let's click on create. And now we can see that we have some kind of an error here, which is said illegal format or missing URL. Basically, this is Insomnia telling us that we don't really have any information yet about where do you want to connect and where do you want to get the information from. So what we're going to be using is we're going to put HTTP. We're going to utilize the local host that we have, and we're going to connect to port 5000. And as you remember here inside the startup configuration, we have specified the query endpoint, which is going to be GraphQL. So let's utilize this and let's put it here. So once we have added, the first thing we need to do before we do anything, we need to update the schema. So basically, let me explain to you what happens here. Once we add this, when we click on schema and we click on refresh schema, what's going to happen? This or any client, or right now other client is Insomnia, it's going to be connecting with our ASP.NET Core application. It's going to check if there's any GraphQL implementation, and in case there is a GraphQL implementation, it's going to check what are the properties that GraphQL has, and then on our side, it's going to see that it has let's go through it, it has the query, so it's going to pull down the query schema and it's going to save it inside our client. So this is really important for us to know. Before we do any request, we need to update the schema. So anytime we do any change to our application, we need to update the schema so it will be so it will have the latest version of the changes that we made. If we keep it like this without updating the schema, the client will not know about the latest changes on the server, and this will not work. So now that we have done that and we have the application ready and we have updated the schema, now let's create our first query, which is gonna be getting information back. So we're gonna start with a query, and basically right now what we're doing is we're utilizing the GraphQL query language. So once we have done that, as you can see, we have right now autocomplete, which is available for us. And why is it available for us? Because what we did is we have updated the schema, and basically it have pulled all of the information directly from the API. So we want to get the lists, and what we want to get from the list, we just want to get the ID, and we just want to get the name. That's all we want. We don't want anything else. Basically, that's everything that we have. And right now, if we want to test it, all we need to do is click on send, and we can see right now that the information has came back directly from the database. So basically, this is called a GraphQL query language, and the GraphQL query language is a very, very big topic. We're just going to be covering here right now the basics of it. And if you want me to delve more into deep of the query language, please write it in the description down below, and I'll make sure to create a video just focusing on the query language of a GraphQL. So right now we have created a simple query, and basically once we have created that simple query, we are able to see that we have the data pulled back. One thing I would like to do here is, let's see what happens if we want to implement simultaneous querying, which is something that GraphQL allows us. So for example, right now we only have the list, but let's say after this we have items. So let's say this is going to be the first query. We're going to call it A, and then let's have another query. We'll call it B, and basically for now, for the demo purposes, it's going to be the same thing, but maybe on the long run it's going to contain the else item inside of it. And let's create another one. It's going to call it C, and we're going to have the same stuff. So right now here we have 3 requests. As we said, GraphQL will allow us to do multiple requests at the same time, and then it will allow us to process those requests directly back into our client. So instead of having 3 different requests, GraphQL will allow us to do these 3 requests at the same time, and it will allow us to get back those information. So right now this is the way that we do it. We specify A, which is going to be the reference for that request, and basically within the same query we send it. So, but right now we're going to have an issue. If we click on send, we can see that we got errors, but as well we got one response. Why is that? Because Entity Framework within ASP.NET Core does not allow threading, or does not allow to have multiple access. So if it's one instance of Entity Framework is executing, we cannot initiate another instance of it. But luckily within ASP.NET Core 5 and .NET 5, this problem has been resolved. So how is it has been resolved? .NET 5 has introduced something called Pool DB Context Factory. And basically a Pool DB Context Factory, it creates a thread pool of a DB context, and whenever we are executing in parallel request against the DB context, every request will take a thread out of that pool, execute it, and then once it finishes, it returns it back to the pool. So how do we accomplish this? It's very easy. What we need to do is we need to go first back to the code. We need to stop our application, and then we need to go to our add DB context, and then from here what we're gonna be using is we're gonna put I think it's gonna add DB, yeah, this is it, add pool DB context factory, and that's gonna be it. So once we have done that, from the startup class, this way we are configuring that this API DB context is going to be able to create a thread pool of that API DB context, and for every request we can pull a thread from that API DB context, utilize the query against it, and once we're finished, we return that thread to our API DB context. Great, so let's save this. The next step is we need to update the query so it will know that it's communicating with a threaded pool instead of a normal API DB context. So how do we do that? It's very simple. It's gonna be a very simple attribute that we need to add to this query, which is gonna be basically use DB context, and we're gonna specify the type of, and basically we're gonna specify the API DB context. So let us fix those references, and basically the use DB context attribute here is gonna allow us to utilize the threaded API DB context and utilize the threads that context provide. So basically, let me repeat, if there is any simultaneous request, let's say we have 3, so these 3 requests, they're gonna go into that threads pool of the API DB context. They're gonna take 3 threads, they're gonna execute their commands against these 3 threads, and once they finish, they're gonna return these 3 threads to the pool. So let us now save this, build our application, and then once this builds successfully, let us run it. And now let's make sure it's running as it should be. Now let's go back to our Insomnia and let's execute this again. And we have the same error. Why is that? Because we need to update the schema. So now let's update the schema. It has updated, and now let's send the request. Okay, my fault. We forgot to update something, which we needed to update the service here. So instead of having it as a service, we need to make it as a scoped service. I apologize for that. And once we have done that, now let us stop the application. Let's build it. Let's run it. I apologize for that. And now let's go back to Insomnia. Let's refresh the schema. And once it's refreshed, let's send the request. And now we can see that the information has came back simultaneously for the first request, for the second request, and for the third request. Perfect. Now that we have done this, we are making sure that our application is running as it should be when it comes to simultaneous requests. So the next step for us is we're gonna be adding another query, which is gonna be responsible for getting the items of the lists. So how are we gonna do that? It's gonna be very simple and very similar to the one that we had before. So we're gonna start with the attribute, use DB context. We're gonna make a type of API DB context. Then we're gonna make it public of type iQueryable, and instead of returning a list, we're gonna return the item data, and we're gonna call it get data. Very nice. And then basically we're gonna put scoped service, because also we're gonna utilize the threaded pool, API DB context, and lastly we're gonna return context.items. Great. So now we have done that. Why is this complaining? Oh, it's use, not user. Okay, great. Once we have done that, let us stop the application again, run it, and let us see what happens if we go to Insomnia, and let us remove this. And first of all, because we added a new query, we need to update the schema. So let's click on schema and let's put refresh schema. Now it has refreshed. So right now I expect that instead of list I should have items. So let's see this be, and if I click on I only have lists. Sorry, we should have data, and we have datas, and right now within those data I can get the ID and I can get the description, for example, but we don't have any data right now saved in our database. But let us execute it, see if it's actually returning something null, which is what we expected. Let us open our database, and inside the items, let's open this table, and let's add one record at least, which is we're gonna call it publish this video, for example, publish, and description, upload YouTube video, if done, no, and the list is basically gonna be work. Let's save this. Let's create another one for food shopping. For example, we're gonna put get potatoes, for example. The description: buy potatoes from the supermarket, and it's done, no, and the list is gonna be 3 for shopping. Great. Let's save this, and now let's execute the query again, and let's see what we got. And as we can see, we have directly got the ID with the description. Now let's see if we want to add the name of the title of this to-do list. And all I need to do is click on send, and we can see that we have got the information back. So that's what we are expecting. Great. So right now we have 2 queries, but what happens if I want to have a link query? So inside the same request, I want to get all of the items inside my lists. So how can I do that? So as we can see here, I can have the items data available for me. And basically right now we're going to be using nested objects. So let's open this. And inside of this, what I want, for example, from inside that object, I want to get the ID. And you can see here the power that the GraphQL provides us. So instead of me having to do multiple calls, all I'm just specifying the exact data that I want with the exact information that I want. And within this query language, GraphQL will be able to return it back to me. So just gonna put the title, and we're gonna put if it's done or not. And that's it. Now let me send, and we can see here we didn't get the information back. And why is that? So because right now when we do any query, it does not automatically link with the sub information that we have. How do we fix that? It's very easy. What we need to do is we need to go back to the query. First, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let us stop this. And inside the query, we need to utilize something called the projections. And how do we enable that? We're going to use projections here, and then let us come here and let us enable it for the both queries. And then after we do this, we need to always remember that we need to add it as well to the configuration of our startup class inside our startup class. So after this, what we need to do is we're going to put use projections. Great. Now let's fix those references. I think it's, oh sorry, it's not use, it's add projections. Yeah, great. So now let's build the application again. So projections means that it allows nested objects. So basically it will allow us to query nested objects from within our application DB context. So now it has built successfully. Let us run it. .NET run. Perfect. Now it's running. Let's go back to Insomnia and let us send the request again. And we can see that we have got exactly the information that we are asking for. So for work, we got published the video, which is false. For personal, we did not have anything. And for food shopping, we got get potatoes and the ID for it, which was false. Perfect. So now that we have done that, we have covered the projections, and now we can see how we can have nested objects from within our applications. Great. The next point that we're going to be discussing is types. And basically types, it will allow us to add some information to our API and basically add some more documentation to our API, so the people who are implementing it will know how to what are the information are for, and basically why do we use it. So there's 2 ways to do that, and we're only going to implement one way, but I'm going to explain the other ones. So the first way to implement it is by going to the actual models itself and add references and add attributes. So for example, we can add these types of attribute here, GraphQL for example, description, and we can specify whatever description that we want. This is a data table, for example, and basically this way we are hard coding this description to this model. And this is not really the best way to do it, because let's say we have a model and this model is being used both by a GraphQL as well as a REST API. So GraphQL is being used only by the mobile app, and for our microservices, for example, we are utilizing the REST API. We don't really want to have GraphQL information injected to the model itself and available for everything. What we want to do is we want to create a type which is going to be automatically injecting this information to our item, to our model, without actually hard coding it. So how do we do that? So inside our GraphQL folder, what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a new folder inside of it, which is going to be calling it, new folder, we're going to call it item data. And basically for every model we're going to create its own folder, and we're going to create a type inside of it. This is just a way in order for us to keep our GraphQL information organized. Excuse me, this should be inside the GraphQL folder, not data folder. So here we need to add that. We're going to call it item. Let's call it, list item. Or we can call it data item, because we're going to start with the data item. Great. And inside this folder here, we're going to basically create a new class, and this class is going to be called item type. Great. So right now, basically what we need to do is we need to create a type which is going to be inheriting from that model, and basically attach some information in order for us to document it. So how do we do that? So first, just for organization purposes, we have created a new folder called data item, and inside of that we have created a class called item type. And inside this class, first we're going to be inheriting from something called the object type. And then we're going to specify of which model, which is going to be in our case the item data. And let's fix those references. And as we can see here, this object type is provided for us by the Hot Chocolate framework, and basically it will allow us to actually inherit directly from this, and would allow us to add properties to this model. So the first thing what we're going to be using is we're going to be utilizing something called the configure method. And basically the configure method is automatically inherited from that object type, and it will allow us to add properties, the one that we have discussed, to our model. So how do we do that? First we need to make it's gonna be a protected, so protected, and we are overriding it from the object type, and it's called configure. As we can see, autocomplete has picked it up, and if we click on it, we can see that has automatically populated for us. And the first thing we're going to be doing is, we don't really need this, we're going to put descriptor dot description. Basically we're adding a description to that model, and we're going to give it the description, and we're going to say this model is used as item for the to-do list. Very straightforward. And for example, it will also allow us to add actual descriptor to specific fields. So let's say I want to add to the item list data here. For example, I want to add more information about the list ID, for example. So how I do that? Let's go back to the item type, and here I can put descriptor dot field. I can just open it up, x dot item lists, because basically we're utilizing the lists, and this is the field that I wanna add more information to. And basically can add description directly and put this is the list that the item belongs to, and that's it. So basically this will allow us to automatically add information to the models without hard coding it directly to our models. So The next step is gonna be resolvers, and basically resolvers is gonna allow us to get information from that model to from the other model. So for example, if we are connecting with the list item, it will allow us directly to inject the model that we want, the item model directly to our list item. It's also a very simple implementation. How do we do that? We're just gonna create a private class called resolvers, and basically inside this item class we're gonna create a request from the DB context. So it's gonna be something like this: public, it's gonna return the item list that we want, or in this case gonna be the item data. It's gonna be of I queryable item data, get items, item list, again scoped service because we want to utilize the threaded DB context. Gonna call it API DB context type context, and let's fix those references. Once we have done that, now all we need to do is just return the type that we want. So it's gonna be return context dot items dot where x dot list id equal list dot id. And basically right now we are dynamically pulling all of the list items to the list directly using this resolver. So how do we link this resolver to our item type? Again, so because we are gonna be adding it directly to the item list, so it makes sense to add it here. So here what we can do is basically we're just gonna put resolve with, and basically we're telling it that it needs to check with the resolver that we have, and basically we get the resolvers. And basically what we need to do is we need to define how this resolver is gonna be pulling the information. So we're gonna use a lambda function, and we're gonna put the get items, and we're gonna define the two parameters, which is gonna be utilizing the defaults one that's gonna be automatically injected for us. So it's gonna be default and default. We're using basically here the default implementations that we have, and we're gonna be injecting on top of that the DB context that we have. So we're gonna put use DB context, and we're gonna be utilizing the API DB context, and that's it. So basically here what we have done right now is we have updated, we have created an object type or a type method for our model, so we don't have to hard code this information into the model. So we have created, we have got this object here, which we have inherited from the Hot Chocolate framework. We have specified it for the item data, and this should be for the item lists. Yes, this should be for the item lists. I apologize. So this should be item list, and this should be item datas. Yes, that's correct. So now we're getting it for the item list, and now here basically we're just defining the description, and then we have to find the description for the item datas. But in order for us to automate the process of getting the information of these items for this list, we have created a resolver, and this resolver basically it's an iQueryable function method that's gonna utilize the list that we have as well as the application DB context, and basically we're gonna perform some kind of a logic in order for us to get the list of items based on the condition of the list ID needs to match, and after that we are directly injecting it into the scripture. Perfect. So once we have done that, the next step that we need to do is inside our startup class. What we need to do here is we need to add the type. So we're gonna put click.add type, and basically we're gonna put it, and it's called item type. Let's fix those references. As for now, we're gonna be continuing to adding the filtering and the sorting for our queries. So how do we do that? It's gonna be also very simple. So the first thing we're gonna be doing is we have to go to the query class, and from there on we need to add use filtering as an attribute, as well as we need to use sorting. Great, so let's copy this one as well and put it on the other query that we have. Perfect, and now let's build our application. Great, it's building. Now we need to update our startup class to utilize those two. So inside here we need to add filtering, as well add sorting. Great, let's save this, and now let's build our application. Perfect, now let's run our application, dotnet run. Now let's go back to Insomnia. First, let's update our schema. Great, now let's stand to make sure everything is still working as it should be. Perfect. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add sorting and the query and filtering to our application. So let's add a new request, and we're gonna call it filtering. As we said, it's gonna be a post, and the body has to be a GraphQL query. Create. Let's take the same URL, and let's update the schema. Perfect. Now let's start with the filtering. So how do we do that? Also, it has to be a GraphQL body. So first we put a query, and then we need to add the filtering. So we put lists, and then inside the list we can specify on what is the condition that we want to filter. And as you can see here, we have automatically got the where and order, because basically we have added the filtering and sorting to our application. So let's start with the filtering first, and basically we're gonna filter based on an ID. So we'll add the condition where, and we said we're gonna filter on an ID, and then we provide the body of it, and we say if it has to equal to, we put the column and we put equal to 1, and now this will allow us to get all of the list where ID equal to 1, and we're gonna get the ID, we're gonna get the name, and we're gonna get the item data. And let's get the ID of the item data. So let's get the title, and let's get if it's done or not. So if it is done or not. Great, let's send this, and now we can see here we got the list where ID equal to 1, and we got the information for it. Now let's change this ID to equal 3. Now we should get the shopping one, and perfect, we got the shopping as well as the item data. Great, so this is for the filtering. Now let's do the sorting. So let's add a new, first let's copy this because we're gonna need it, and now let's add a new request, and we're gonna call it sorting. As well, it has to be a post, and has to be a GraphQL query. Let's create it, let's add this here, let's refresh the schema. Great, I think this is the wrong one. Okay, refresh the schema. Now let's implement it. So it has to be a query as well. So query, and then we're gonna get the list, and then basically here we can specify the order that we want, and we want to say that we want to by the name, and we want to make it descending, and now all we need to do is just do the ID and the name, and let's send this, and now we can see we have it in the ascending order, and if we switch it to ascending, we have 3, 2, 1. Perfect. So now this covers the sorting as well as the filtering. The next step that we're going to be covering is a mutation. And the mutation is when we want to add, edit, and delete data. To implement a mutation, we need to add two new classes inside our GraphQL folder. And this mutation class will contain two methods. One for adding the list and the other one for adding the items. So we'll start by adding our input models inside the GraphQL list. As well, we need to add two files, basically the add list input as well as the add list payload. And this is not going to be a normal class. For this, we're going to be utilizing the record that has been introduced within .NET 5. So let's go back to our application. Let's stop it. And basically what we're going to be doing inside the list, inside GraphQL data item, let's create a new folder. We'll call it data list, or call it list actually. And inside the list, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new class, and we're gonna call it add list input. And basically, instead of having this as a class, we're gonna change it to a record. Let's delete this. And basically, this record is gonna only take a name. Perfect. And we're gonna add another one, add a new class, and we're gonna call it add list payload. And again, this is gonna be a record. As well, if you don't know what a record is, I have another video related to all of the new feature in .NET 5, which I'm gonna link here on the upper right hand corner. So for the payload, basically we're just gonna return the list type. So I'm gonna put item list, or yeah, item list, and call it list. Now we're gonna return, the item type. Because we have already did the overriding for it. So this basically this is gonna be okay. So basically here I messed up the naming convention. This should be list instead of item, and this should be inside this folder. I apologize for that, so let's fix it now. So let's type let's rename this to list type. Let's move it here, and let's change it to lists. Let's remove item. And let's update this one, so it's gonna be list type. Perfect. And here let's delete this, and it's gonna be list type. Okay, great. So now that we have fixed those, the next step for us is now we need to add the mutation. And how do we add it? Inside the main GraphQL folder, we need to add a new class. And this new class, we're gonna call it mutation. Great. Now what we're gonna be doing is inside this mutation class, we're gonna add a method, and this method is gonna be responsible for adding the new list item. So how are we gonna do that? First, we're gonna create an attribute, which is gonna be use db context of type of API db context. Let's fix the references after. And now it's gonna be public async task of type add list payload. So that's what we're gonna return after the list has been added successfully, and we're gonna call it add list async, and it's gonna take the add list input, and then we need to add the scoped service, scoped service of API db context type context. And now let's fix those references before we continue. So the first thing is the db context, then the API, then the task, then the payload, and lastly the list input, the scoped service. Perfect. Now once we have done that, now let's add the functionality to add the list item. So var list equal new item list, and this needs to also fix it. And basically all we need to do is add the name of it equal input.name. And here if we're gonna add more validation, all of this can be added here inside this method. But for now we're just gonna keep it as is. All we're gonna do is connect to the context .lists .add list. Great. And then we're gonna make await context.save changes async. Perfect. Once we have done that, now all we need to do is return the add list payload. And how do we do that? Basically we need to add the return new add list payload, and basically it's gonna take a list, an item list. So we're just gonna return the list. What does it take? Add list payload. Let's double check that. So this is gonna take an item list. Okay, great. So now that we have our mutation ready, what we need to do is that now we need to update our startup class. So why is this one broken? So it's saying list type cannot be found. Let's try to build it. .NET build. Data item namespace does not exist. So startup.cs. Let's see. Okay, so let's remove this. Okay, that should be fine. And now let's build it again. Okay, it's building great. Now let's add our mutation. So we can put .add mutation type, and we're gonna call it mutation as we have created before. Perfect. And now let's try that out. So let's run the application. .NET run. Perfect. Now let's go back to Insomnia, and here let us create a new request, and we'll call it mutation. As we said, it's gonna be of type post, and the body is gonna be GraphQL query. We're gonna create it, and let's get the same URL, and let's update the schema. Great. So the first thing we're gonna be doing is, instead of having a normal query, we're gonna change it to a mutation. So mutation, and we're gonna put add list because that's the only one that we have. And then we need to specify the input, and basically we're gonna specify the name, and it's gonna be, let's say the list is gonna be what are we gonna call it? Studying, for example. Great. So once we have done that, now let's just specify the list that we want to return back. So basically, as we said, we're gonna add it, and then we're expecting a payload back. So our payload is of type list, and all we want is the name and the ID, so we can make sure it has the right ID. Great. So let us do a quick summary here. So if you look at the other ones, we have a query because we are querying the API, but within a mutation we are actually adding value to it. So we have the add list, we specify what do we want to add. Basically here we're going to adding a new list of type, we named it studying, and then basically after that here we are just getting back the information, because that mutation is returning back a payload, and this payload basically is the add list payload, and this add list payload is basically returning for us a list, and we are displaying the ID and the name. So let's send this and see what do we get back. Perfect. So we can see right now we have the ID has auto incremented to 4, and we have the studying has automatically been added. So let's add another one. For example, let's say cooking. Now we should see the ID equal to 5. Perfect. Great. So now once we have done that, now let's add the mutation for the data item. So inside the data item, let's add a new class, and we'll call it the add item input, and this is also gonna be a record. And let's remove this, and basically we're gonna take a string for the title, string for the description, and let's say it's gonna take a boolean for the is done. I think that should be fine, as well as let's take an int for the list ID. Great. So let's save this, and now let's create another record, and this is going to be the payload. So add item payload, and basically this is going to be also a record, and this record is going to return an item list. Sorry, an item data, and we're gonna call it data. So let's fix those references. Perfect. Now once we have done that, inside the mutation, let's add another one. Same, we'll start with an attribute, use db context, type of API db context, and now we start with a function, public async task add item payload. Let's fix those references. We'll fix it after. So we'll call it add item list. So I'll add item async, better. And basically it's gonna put add item input, and the T is not capital here. I'm gonna call it input. It's gonna take also a scoped service with the API db context and called context. Great. Let's fix those references. So this one is gonna be this. Should be fine. Okay, great. Now we're gonna make it var item equal new item data, and basically right now we need to fill the information. So the ID is auto generated, so is done equal input dot is done. Let's make the indentation, and then it's gonna be the title description equal input dot description, then list ID equal input dot list ID, and lastly the title equal input dot title. Great. Once we have done that, this is added to the context. So context dot items dot add item, and then we're gonna make it await context dot complete async. Sorry, dot save it changes async. Perfect. Once we have done that, all we need to do is return the payload, which is gonna be add new add item payload, and it's gonna take item. Great. And after we have done that, all we need to do, we don't really need to update the startup because the startup has already been added for this class. So let us just run the application again and run it. And let's go back to Insomnia. Let's refresh the schema. And now let's delete this and then add a new mutation. And basically we're gonna add item. So now we can see first we had add list, now we have add item. And now let's specify the input that we wanna add. And basically from the input, we're gonna first add the title. And the title is gonna be, let's make it for cooking, prepare the oven, for example. And the description is gonna be, the description, it's gonna be turn on the oven. Great. And then was gonna be the done equal false, 0 or false, should be work. And then basically right now we're gonna put the list ID, and the list ID is equal to 5. And once we have done that, the last thing that we're gonna be doing is, I think this one could be is done. Is done, yeah. And the last thing we wanna do is what are we gonna return? So all we're gonna return after this is is data. And we're gonna get the ID and the data. And let's see what information, I think we have the title. Yep, title. So let's send this. And now we can see that we have got the ID back and prepare the oven. So now let's go back to the lists and let's get all of these. Send. And now we can see for the cooking one, we have prepare the oven. Now let's add another one. We'll call it, for example, cut the tomatoes. And here, for example, get the tomato from the fridge. Okay, now let's send this. Perfect. Now let's go to the list and send it. And we can see now we have 2 items inside our list. Great. So this basically complete our lesson for today related to the GraphQL. Please ask any of your question in the description, in the comments down below. If you have any questions or any suggestions or anything that you would like me to delve more in depth to, please also suggest it in the comments down below. Please like, share and subscribe if you find this video helpful. And if you already made it this far, please add your favorite chocolate bar in the comments so I will know that you have reached this far and I will like your comment. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day.